So we just explored the issues with CSS. The main one being styles leaking across components because of the shared namespace in CSS. Well, as I mentioned, CSS in JS solves this problem. But before we test out one library, we just have to remind ourselves about how we did it before in React, or how we were at least capable of doing it in React. We could write this object and append it to the style property on our div, which does solve the CSS problem because this is also extremely specific. Doing it this way will never cause styles to bleed across our components, because when we see how it's rendered, it's applied to a style property on our div element and actually not in the CSS namespace. This is technically CSS in JS because we are still technically using JavaScript to render our CSS. The only issue with this is that we don't have access to all of our selectors because the HTML, which this is, does not support all of the selectors that we might want to add to our components, right? So as a result, what we need to do is use a CSS in JS library. And we can get all of this functional scoping, but in a different way. So the library we're using is styled components. And it's the most popular library. So in order to use it, we just have to include it in our project. So I did a yarn add style components earlier, and now it's in our project. And to use it, we import in the styled keyword from styled components. And this styled keyword allows us to actually generate components. And I'll show you how it works. So first, we're going to declare a new component the same way we normally would, right? We would use our capital case as we do with our components. And then what we say is it's equal to styled dot and then the HTML element we want. So if I want a div, I'm going to do style.div. If I wanted a paragraph tag, I would do style.p. If I wanted an image tag, I would do style.image. But I want a div. And after that, we give it a string, an interpolation string, right? As we're used to using. Inside of here, we can just write CSS. We don't need to do this camel case that we had to do in this style. We can just write color goes to red, and then we can write font size in our kebab case goes to 28 pixels. And now we actually are able to use this component the same way that we use it anywhere else. So instead of using this div, I am instead going to use this text component, and inside I'm going to say I am a component. And now if we look at our application, we'll see that our component is updated. And the way that it works is what it does is it gives that component a unique string class. So you see all this text that was suddenly added to our class of our div, which is this text component. Well, what it does is it generates this unique string for the class, and then in the head, it appends a unique style CSS file, so a style tag, with that specificity specific to just this div. So now, because it's so specific and it's so unique, these styles will never bleed across our application. Because for every new style component that we create, it gets a unique class name. And then it will generate a new style sheet with those unique styles pointing to this unique class name. So now we could name even our components the same names, whatever. It would not matter because those styles are scoped to this uniquely generated class name for our components. And this is possible because we're leveraging JavaScript to render our CSS. And this is extremely powerful because we get true isolation, right? Scoping our selectors in CSS the way that we did, where even in Sass, where we nested everything as deep as it did, is not truly enough because we still might accidentally make mistakes. It's still possible. Whereas using style components, it's not, because these are guaranteed to be unique class names. Whereas when we write, we can never guarantee that the class names we're writing will 100% be unique. It also becomes hard for us to sift through massive CSS files to remove unused styles. Whereas here we know that if we're not using the style anymore, we're literally removing the component, right? So if we didn't need text anymore, for example, well, we just would never see an instance of text in the component that we're writing it to. In the same way, we're now able to also share this component anywhere that it might be needed. So we're actually able to reuse more of our code because it's almost like sharing properties, right? Or sharing constants, as we're commonly used to inside of our components and React architecture. The other great thing is that because we're rendering JavaScript, unlike that previous style where we had the style property, we were mentioning that the HTML does not support all of the possible selectors. But because this is just CSS, all of our selectors are supported. And the great thing is that we're also now suddenly able to leverage props in our styled components to render their CSS ruling. This was extremely difficult to do with just CSS, but we can now use JavaScript to control our styles. And how we would do that is very similar to how we can pass props into our regular components. Just because our text is pretty much considered a component. And what we pass to it would be, for example, we passed an isActive property. And it's a Boolean value. And depending on whether or not isActive is true or false, we render a different border. So we could do border, and now we actually are able to access our props by using a function. Now, because this is a string, we have to interpolate, right? So we use our string interpolation, and we say, in this function, I want to destructure off of the props, which are passed in, right? I want the prop of isActive. And what I'm going to return is a string where I'm going to check if isActive is true. In fact, I'm not even going to do it like this. I'm going to say isActive is true. If it is, then I want to return a 1 pixel solid black border. If it's false, I want to return a 3 pixel dotted green border. And now if we save and we go back to our application, we see that because it's true, our border was generated with the 1 pixel solid black. But if I were to change this to false, well, we suddenly see our dotted green border. And this is extremely powerful because now our components are able to leverage props to decide on their style, which makes them even more specific. It gives us even a greater degree of control over our CSS. So with all this, we can now start converting our React application using styled components.